Welcome to the Centre for Brexit Studies YouTube channel. I'm joined today by researcher David Hearne. So David, the UK formally left the EU just 5 days ago. Have there been any changes so far?
Not really. There have been a handful of tiny technical changes that, let's face it, won't affect the majority of us. I've lost my right to vote in European elections. It wasn't scheduled to be an election to the European Parliament this year anyway. I've lost my right to stand in any future election, and I've lost my representation, so I cease to have any representative of the European Parliament. However, in very practical terms, for most of us, very little, if anything, has changed. If you live in EU member states, you might have noticed some very minor changes. You no longer can automatically vote in municipal elections necessarily. But for most people, most of the time, no, nothing's changed thanks to the transition period.
So Brexit has gone quite quiet in the press. Do you think the atmosphere around Brexit has changed? And do you think there is now just a need to talk about anything other than the B word?
Well, Boris Johnson rather famously banned the term Brexit from sort of cabinet meetings or whatever. The logic being that he wants to claim he has got Brexit done, and therefore we can talk about other things. In practical terms, it's nonsense. I mean, Brexit's not done, for better or for worse, because although we have de facto left the EU, de jure left the EU, we are obviously de facto members in most regards, at least until the end of the transition period. But nothing about the future has been decided, really, nothing beyond the next 11 months. That's not quite true if you live in Northern Ireland, but for the rest of us, very little has been decided as to what the future might look like. So no, it's not done. We've not seen any mention of the B word, but we've seen plenty of talk about trade negotiations, which is essentially a euphemism saying the same thing.
So Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that there is no need for the UK to follow EU rules on trade, but the EU's Michel Barnier is calling for a level playing field. Is this a sign of what's to come in trade negotiations?
I mean, look, if two sides started out completely agreeing about everything, then there wouldn't be a negotiation. You don't need to negotiate with someone that you agree about everything on. You simply sign a piece of paper, say this is the way it will be. Nevertheless, I think there's a strong incentive to come to some arrangement. Both sides say that they want there to be tariff-free, quota-free access. Both sides agree that equivalence in some sectors would be helpful. So there's a wide range of agreement. I wouldn't understate that. There's also likely to be lots of sabre rattling and lots of chest beating. That's definitely true on the Johnson side, so that he can convince the ultras within his own party that he is being tough with the EU and that he is going to diverge, or the UK is going to diverge from European regulation in many areas. But there's also a sense on the EU side that there needs to be some kind of advantage, some clear advantage to being an EU member, otherwise why would anyone bother? So the UK can't have its cake and eat it. Now, that being said, I think that there's a clear zone where we can come to some arrangement, we meaning all involved, that is beneficial for all sides.
So it's looking like the support for another Scottish referendum is increasing. Pollster says that the yes vote for leaving the UK has gone up to 52%. Is this down to Brexit and the likelihood of Scotland rejoining the EU?
Yes, this is definitely down to Brexit. There is absolutely no question about that. There is zero question whatsoever that the reason that support for Scottish independence has increased dramatically in the last year or two is because of Brexit. Full stop. The end. That being said, there have been one or two opinion polls over the past 12 months showing a majority in favour of independence. I would throw in a note of caution there, which is to say, one, these things are quite knife edge. There were plenty of polls before the EU referendum in the UK, for example, that showed that Remain was ahead 52 to 48, and obviously the event result was the other way around. That was true also, incidentally, some polls showing results a few percentage points off before the previous Scottish referendum. However, this does suggest that Nicola Sturgeon is making progress in arguing that there should be another independence referendum. And I do think that there is a very, very, very real likelihood that Scotland will choose to no longer be part of the Union. If that happens, it will have been almost entirely due to Brexit. Brexit will have broken Britain.
And on that point, is it even more likely then that Wales and Northern Ireland could also start considering the same as Scotland? And could the UK be no longer in the future?
Well, I mean, I think the moment that Scotland leaves the UK, it will effectively no longer be the UK. It will be Scotland, and it will be some rump UK, whatever you choose to call it. It's no longer the same country. It will have lost a third of its land mass, a decent proportion, around 10%, of its population. It will no longer be the same country. There is a Welsh independence movement. It's much, much weaker than the Scottish independence movement. There is some signs, there are some signs, some quite strong signs that the Welsh independence movement has grown and is growing substantially in previous years. It is nowhere near the kind of levels that the Scottish independence movement is. If you held a vote in Wales tomorrow, then the result would be pretty overwhelming to remain part of the UK. Wales, unlike Scotland, actually voted to leave the EU in 2016 on the whole. That being said, don't underestimate the impact that Scottish independence will have on Wales, particularly if it is seen to be a success. Northern Ireland is another story entirely, and it will be very interesting to see what happens in the future there. I think some form of unification with the Republic of Ireland is likely in the long term, but how that will take, what form that will take, will be difficult. It will be difficult for everyone to achieve.
Thanks for joining me, David.
Thank you.